A seasoned survivalist who had spent much of his life testing himself against the elements walked into the Ozarks one summer with nothing but his gear, his knowledge of the wild, and a determination to live off the land for as long as he could. He was no stranger to isolation. Friends described him as disciplined, resourceful, and at times obsessed with pushing human limits. For him, the wilderness wasn't just a backdrop for adventure, it was home, a proving ground, a place where the distractions of the modern world fell away. He had done this before in smaller stretches, spending weeks at a time alone in the woods, documenting his techniques and challenges. But this time was different. He told those closest to him that he wanted to stay out longer, to see if he could truly disappear into the forest and emerge only when he chose. That was the last anyone saw of him. When days turned into weeks without a word, friends and family began to worry. At first, they assumed he wanted space or had gone deeper into the wilderness than usual. But when his return date came and went without even a trace, panic began to spread. Search parties formed, led by local authorities and experienced trackers who knew the Ozarks well. They scoured trails, creeks, caves, and ridgelines, calling his name, hoping to catch even a sign of a campfire or footprints in the mud. The forest, however, was silent. The Ozarks are a labyrinth of thick trees, rocky outcrops, and endless hollows where one can vanish without a sound, and as the days stretched into months, the vastness of the terrain mocked every attempt to uncover him. His disappearance quickly became more than a missing persons case. It grew into a legend that haunted the region. Locals swapped stories of eerie encounters in the woods, hikers claimed to stumble on crude shelters abandoned in haste, and hunters reported strange carvings on trees that seemed to serve as markers or warnings. Nothing connected cleanly to him, but each detail added to the mythos of a man swallowed whole by the wilderness he loved. Some believed he had chosen to vanish, that he was living somewhere deep within the forest, beyond the reach of civilization. Others feared the worst, that he had fallen prey to injury, starvation, or the merciless unpredictability of nature. As the seasons cycled and 3 years slipped away, the survivalist story became one told around campfires, with his name spoken as though he were both legend and ghost. Families camping in the Ozarks would tell children to respect the forest, reminding them that even the most skilled could disappear if they underestimated its power. His family carried the heaviest burden, torn between hope and grief, never certain whether he was out there struggling, thriving, or already gone. For them, the silence was the cruelest part. No message, no remains, no closure. Just the endless expanse of the Ozarks, guarding its secrets tightly, as if the land itself had claimed him forever. As the years passed and the initial shock of his disappearance settled into a heavy silence, the survivalist story transformed into folklore whispered among locals and visitors to the Ozarks. Around campfires, beneath the glow of lanterns, hikers and campers spoke in hushed tones about the man who vanished without a trace. Parents told their children the tale as a warning about the unforgiving power of the wilderness, reminding them that the forest gave nothing freely and demanded respect in return. The survivalist had not been an amateur, not someone unprepared or reckless. He was skilled, disciplined, and confident. Yet if someone like him could vanish in these woods, then anyone could. That idea struck fear into even the most casual of adventurers. Reports began to surface of strange and unsettling discoveries scattered throughout the deep woods. Some hikers claimed they stumbled upon makeshift shelters, crude lean-tos constructed from fallen branches and tied together with vines. They looked functional but abandoned, as though someone had left in haste, never to return. Others spoke of carvings etched into tree bark, strange symbols, initials, or arrows that seemed to point nowhere. No one could say for sure if these traces belonged to the missing man, but each new account kept his story alive. Even seasoned outdoorsmen admitted the possibility. They said it was just like him to leave signs, breadcrumbs in the wilderness, as though he had wanted someone to follow, yet each trail led to nowhere, fading into the vast and endless Ozarks. Hunters, too, added to the legend. Some claimed to hear distant noises late at night, rhythmic tapping like stones striking together, or faint whistles that didn't seem to come from any bird or animal they knew. While skeptics dismissed these as the product of overactive imaginations, others insisted the missing survivalist might still be out there, communicating in the only ways he could. Every abandoned shelter, every strange sound, every eerie marking became another piece of a puzzle that only deepened the mystery. But as the months rolled into years, hope began to wither. Official searches had long since ended, their resources exhausted. Families and volunteers had returned home, leaving behind a forest that seemed to close in tighter around its secret. For many, the silence of the Ozarks was the most haunting sound of all. With each passing season, the survivalist story grew less like a real case and more like a ghost tale, one that the forest itself seemed to whisper through the rustling leaves. He had become both a warning and a mystery, a reminder of the delicate line between human will and the wild's indifference. Then, one sweltering summer afternoon, a quiet ripple stirred the calm of the Ozarks when a local fisherman noticed something peculiar while resting by the edge of a slow-moving creek. He had been casting his line for hours, lulled by the sound of cicadas and the steady murmur of the water, when a large snapping turtle surfaced beside him. At first, he paid it little attention. Turtles were a common sight in those waters, their ancient shells glistening in the sun as they drifted lazily. But as the creature turned, the fisherman's eyes locked onto something that jolted him upright. The turtle's shell was marked with grooves, not natural scarring or scratches from rocks, but deliberate carvings. The lines were too straight, too intentional, and as he squinted closer, he saw what looked alarmingly like numbers. He pulled the turtle gently closer with his net, his heart hammering with a mix of excitement and unease. The shell bore not just random scratches, but a series of coordinates carefully etched into its surface. The markings were weathered, faded by time and the elements, but their precision was undeniable. This was no accident of nature. Someone had carved them, long ago, by the look of it. The fisherman's first thought was disbelief. Who would mark a turtle like this? And more importantly, why? As realization dawned, the fisherman's hands trembled. He had heard the old stories about the survivalist who had vanished years before, swallowed by the very forest that now surrounded him. Could this turtle be carrying a message from that lost man? The idea was almost too strange to grasp, yet the weight of the markings pressed heavily on his mind. He quickly jotted the numbers down on a scrap of paper from his tackle box, afraid the moment might slip away like a dream. He released the turtle back into the creek, watching as it disappeared beneath the water's surface, carrying its mysterious message into the depths once more. With his heart racing, he packed his gear and hurried back to town. He knew the story would sound absurd. Coordinates carved into a turtle's shell, discovered 3 years after a man vanished, but he also knew what he had seen. The etched lines were deliberate, careful, the work of someone desperate to be found. When he finally reported the discovery to authorities, his account was met with raised eyebrows and skepticism. Officials suspected he had mistaken scratches for symbols, or worse, that he was embellishing the local legend for attention. But the fisherman's conviction did not waver. He insisted the markings were real, and his description of them was too detailed, too precise to be dismissed as mere imagination. Though reluctant, wildlife officers eventually agreed to investigate. If there was even the smallest chance that this discovery was connected to the missing man, it could not be ignored. That afternoon at the creek, under the glaring sun, a simple fisherman had stumbled upon the key that might unlock one of the Ozarks' most enduring mysteries. What had been dismissed as folklore and ghost story now flickered with new possibility, all because of a turtle carrying a message etched into its very shell, like a messenger chosen by the wilderness itself. When the fisherman brought his strange discovery to the authorities, the initial reaction was one of disbelief. A turtle carrying coordinates on its back sounded more like the setup to a tall tale than evidence in a missing persons case. Officers exchanged skeptical glances, whispering that the man might be confusing scars from rocks or even moss patterns for something deliberate. Still, the fisherman's insistence was unwavering. He described the numbers in detail, the clean lines of the carvings, the way they seemed too straight, too purposeful to be a trick of nature. His conviction forced them to listen, though not without smirks and sighs. Eventually, wildlife officers agreed to accompany him back to the creek where he'd made the discovery. The group moved quietly through the underbrush, the heat pressing down, cicadas buzzing above, until they reached the slow-moving water. It took hours of patient waiting and netting before the large snapping turtle surfaced again. When they finally caught it, the mood shifted. The animal thrashed with surprising power, snapping at the air, but the officers held steady, lifting it carefully to examine its shell. That was the moment the scoffs faded into silence. There it was, carved deep into the hard ridges of the turtle's back, numbers, symbols, and lines too exact to be natural. The grooves had aged, dulled by years of algae and weather, but beneath the grime the clarity remained. Under magnification, the markings looked unmistakably like latitude and longitude, etched with a careful hand. The officers stared at one another, no longer laughing. What had seemed like a ridiculous fisherman's tale now sat heavy in front of them, alive and undeniable. For a long while, no one spoke. The implications stretched beyond the shell of this single turtle. If the survivalist had truly left his message here, then the man had not only survived long enough to think strategically but had also imagined a rescue. The turtle, he must have reasoned, would wander, carrying his coordinates like a drifting letter in a bottle, waiting for someone, anyone, to read it. The idea was haunting in its brilliance and desperation. Yet skepticism lingered in the official's eyes. Why a turtle? Could this really be a message? Some muttered theories of vandalism, suggesting that kids or hikers might have done it years ago as a cruel prank. Others pointed to the precision of the carving, its intentionality, and the fact that the location matched no known park rangers' markings or tagging practices. The room for coincidence shrank quickly. The turtle was documented, photographed, and its shell mapped. The coordinates, when checked, pointed to a remote and heavily forested section of the Ozarks, miles from any known trails or campsites. It was a place few dared to go, a maze of steep ridges, tangled growth, and hidden hollows. If the missing survivalist had been there, it would explain why no one had found him. What had begun as a fisherman's unbelievable story now carried the weight of possibility. The officers could no longer dismiss it as fantasy. They had tangible evidence in front of them, etched not on paper or stone, but into the living armor of a creature that had likely roamed the forest for decades. A clue had finally surfaced after 3 long years of silence, and it came from the most unexpected of messengers. The forest had whispered nothing, but the turtle had spoken. The decision was made quietly but with a heavy sense of urgency. Someone had to follow the coordinates carved into the turtle's shell. A small team of searchers was assembled, made up of local law enforcement, a few experienced trackers, and volunteers who had long held an interest in the case of the missing survivalist. They knew the location would not be easy to reach. The coordinates pointed to a section of the Ozarks notorious for its density, a tangled expanse of towering oaks, jagged limestone cliffs, and thick undergrowth where even animals seemed reluctant to roam. It was not marked on recreational maps, nor did it intersect with established trails. It was a place avoided because of its difficulty, a place that seemed to dare people to enter. The team set out early one morning, their packs heavy with supplies, machetes in hand to carve through the growth. The air was damp and heavy, clinging to their skin, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the silence of their focus. Every step felt as though it took them deeper into something untouched, primeval, a world where the forest ruled and humans were only intruders. The further they went, the more they realized why no one had stumbled across the survivalist before. This was a land designed to erase footprints, to swallow evidence whole, to guard secrets with vines and thorns. Hours turned into a day, and the trek grew harsher. They crossed narrow ridges where one misstep meant a fall into unseen depths, waded through streams where slick stones threatened to send them tumbling, and battled through underbrush so thick it felt like the forest itself was pushing them back. Despite exhaustion, the group pressed forward, guided only by their GPS and the hope that the turtle's message might finally answer the years of silence. There was something eerie in their mission, following the breadcrumbs left not in notes or maps but on the back of a living creature. Each mile deeper felt like following a trail the survivalist had designed for them, his ghost guiding their path. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the second day, they set up camp near a rocky outcrop. Sitting around the fire, they spoke little. The weight of what they were doing hung in the air. Some wondered aloud what they might find. Was he alive when he carved those coordinates, or was this his final desperate act before the wilderness claimed him? Others remained quiet, staring into the flames, their thoughts clouded by the strangeness of it all. A message delivered by a turtle 3 years after a man vanished, it felt both miraculous and cruel. The next morning, with the coordinates nearly reached, the terrain grew steeper, more hostile. Brambles clawed at their clothes, insects swarmed relentlessly, and the forest grew darker under the canopy. The GPS finally beeped as they neared the exact point. The air seemed to change, heavier, as though the forest itself knew they were approaching something long hidden. Every step forward tightened the knot in their stomachs. After 3 years of silence, the searchers were about to discover what had become of the man who had once walked into these woods believing he could master them. At the marked location, the forest opened into a shallow clearing, as if the trees themselves had stepped back to reveal what lay hidden. The team stopped almost in unison, their breaths catching, because there it was, a remnant of life, a whisper of the man who had vanished. Strung between 2 weathered trees, tatters of a tarp still clung stubbornly despite years of storms. Its fabric was brittle and faded, riddled with holes, sagging under the weight of moss and leaves. Around it, the faint outlines of a camp took shape. Rocks arranged in a circle showed the blackened remains of a fire long gone cold, the ashes now damp earth. Rusted tins, unidentifiable tools, and fragments of rope lay half buried under the leaf litter, each piece a time capsule of desperation. The searchers moved slowly, reverently, afraid that their footsteps might disturb the fragile evidence of the survivalist's final days. A hunter's snare lay collapsed a few feet away, still coiled in the underbrush, its spring rusted but intact. Beside it, a knife handle protruded from the soil, the blade eaten away by rust but unmistakably used, the grip worn from countless hands. These were not the careless traces of a traveler passing through. This had been a home, a fortress against the wilderness, one built by someone who had refused to give up easily. Then, under a fallen log near the camp's center, one of the volunteers noticed something unusual, a leather-bound book, swollen from rain but miraculously still intact. Hands trembling, they lifted it into the light. It was a journal, its pages stuck together, fragile with age, but with care they began to peel them apart. Faded ink sprawled across the entries, shaky but legible in places. Each line was a glimpse into the man's struggle, his attempts to ration dwindling supplies, his accounts of storms and injuries, his battle with hunger. Some passages described faint hopes that someone might stumble across his camp. Others carried the heaviness of despair, confessions that he feared the forest was larger, harsher, and more unyielding than even he had believed. The entries revealed that he had tried to navigate his way back to civilization but became trapped in the labyrinth of ridges and hollows. Injuries slowed him, food grew scarce, yet what struck the team most was his resolve. He had not simply lain down to die. He had written with purpose, documenting every effort to endure, leaving a trail of words in the hope that they would one day be read. Most haunting of all was his mention of the turtle. In one smeared but decipherable entry, he wrote about carving coordinates into its shell. He reasoned that unlike humans, animals would not remain trapped in this remote pocket. A turtle could wander for miles, eventually crossing paths with people. It was his last message, his final act of ingenuity, a gamble that someday, someone would read what he had etched. The searchers stood in silence, the journal in hand, the camp around them whispering the story of a man who had refused to fade quietly into the wilderness. Here was proof that he had survived far longer than anyone had guessed, fighting to the very end. Though the forest had claimed his body, it had not erased his determination. The clearing, once hidden, had become a shrine to human resilience, and a reminder of how close survival and tragedy can walk hand in hand. The journal entry about the turtle was smudged and water damaged, but enough of it remained to paint a picture of a man at the edge of exhaustion, thinking with the last reserves of his strength. He had written about days when he could barely stand, when hunger gnawed so deeply he felt lightheaded, and when every noise in the forest made him wonder if it was predator or hallucination. Yet even in that state, his mind had turned to strategy. He must have realized that no search team would ever stumble across this remote clearing by chance. His efforts to leave markers on trees or to backtrack toward trails had only pulled him deeper into the labyrinth of the Ozarks. But nature itself offered him one last chance, a messenger not bound to one place. The entry described his decision with clarity: if he could not escape, then perhaps a creature could. He observed the turtles that wandered near his camp, slow but steady travelers of streams and muddy banks, creatures that roamed far and wide over time. The idea struck him like a spark. He would carve his coordinates into the shell of one, turning it into a living message, a drifting courier that would one day cross paths with human eyes. He knew it was desperate, almost absurd, but in the wilderness absurd ideas sometimes became lifelines. One passage in particular stood out. He wrote of capturing the turtle with trembling hands, of apologizing to it as if it could understand, and of carefully etching the numbers into its shell with his knife. The lines had to be deep enough to endure but careful enough not to wound the animal beyond its armor. His words carried a strange mix of guilt and hope, guilt for marking a living creature, and hope that this being might one day deliver his cry for help. When the carving was done, he set the turtle back into the creek, watching it disappear slowly into the water as if carrying a piece of his soul with it. To the searchers reading these words years later, the scene was almost unbearable to imagine. A man weakened, hungry, and alone, summoning enough will to perform such a deliberate act, knowing he might never live to see if it succeeded. The turtle was his last gamble, a plan both ingenious and heartbreaking. He must have sat by the water's edge after releasing it, torn between despair and flickers of hope, wondering if the creature would ever cross paths with another human, if anyone would ever know the message he had entrusted to it. The journal made clear that this act was not born of madness, but of clarity sharpened by desperation. The survivalist had not surrendered easily. He had fought until the end, adapting in ways few could imagine, leaving behind not just a makeshift camp and worn tools but an idea so extraordinary that it endured years later. The turtle was not just an animal anymore, it was a vessel of human resilience, carrying the proof that he had lived, struggled, and reached out to the world one final time. Though the journal gave the searchers more answers than they had ever hoped to find, the clearing held another secret that pressed on them like a weight. A few hundred feet from the remnants of the camp, one of the trackers noticed something pale jutting out from beneath a blanket of leaves and moss. At first, it looked like nothing more than the bleached remains of fallen branches, but a closer look froze him in his tracks. These were not branches. They were bones. The group approached slowly, the forest suddenly silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. Beneath the damp soil and forest debris lay a scattering of skeletal remains. Some were large, unmistakably human, while others were fractured, gnawed at the edges by time and animals. Nearby lay scraps of fabric, so decayed that only faint traces of color remained, yet they seemed to match the tattered clothing still clinging to the camp. Though they could not immediately confirm it, everyone present felt the same chilling certainty: these were the final traces of the survivalist. Forensic specialists later examined the site, but the years had taken their toll. The bones bore no clear marks of violence, no sign of a single catastrophic injury. Instead, they told the story of slow erosion, the kind that comes from exposure to the elements and the relentless passage of time. Perhaps he had fallen ill, weakened by hunger or infection. Perhaps an injury left him unable to hunt or move. Or perhaps he had simply grown too exhausted to fight anymore. The journal had trailed off with unfinished entries, words growing weaker and fainter, like a voice fading into silence. What struck the team most was the position of the remains. They were not scattered wildly but gathered in a way that suggested he had chosen his final place, lying down in the shadow of the trees he had once used for shelter. There was a dignity to it, a quiet acceptance. He had survived longer than most could in such isolation, yet in the end, the forest's vastness had outlasted him. It had not been a dramatic end but a slow surrender, as if the wilderness had simply absorbed him into itself. And yet, even in death, his story had not been erased. The turtle had carried his message. The journal had preserved his voice. The bones, silent as they were, spoke of a man who fought until the very last, who left behind traces not out of carelessness but out of determination to be remembered. For the searchers, the discovery brought no triumph, only solemn reflection. They had not found a man waiting for rescue, but they had found proof that he had not vanished into nothingness. His ingenuity, his will, and his final desperate hope had endured long enough to be seen. The forest had claimed his body, yes, but it had failed to silence his story. His tale was now etched into more than a turtle's shell, it was engraved into human memory, into the lore of the Ozarks, into the lesson of how thin the line between survival and tragedy can be. The town that had once been filled with whispers of the missing teenagers now sat under an eerie hush as new discoveries came to light. The police had unearthed more than just scattered belongings. They found an old, half-rotted backpack buried deep in the soil, its zippers rusted, its fabric torn by time and moisture. Inside were notebooks smeared with mud, pages sticking together, and faint scribbles that looked like the desperate writings of young hands. Parents who stood nearby watching the excavation gasped when one officer gently lifted a page where the words, though faint, could still be read: "We can hear them at night. They are watching us." The silence that followed was heavier than any before. No one moved, no one dared breathe loudly. The discovery shifted the story from a tragic accident to something far darker, something that hinted at stalking, fear, and possibly pursuit before the kids disappeared. Reporters quickly gathered around, snapping photos, their voices trembling as they spoke into cameras about the chilling notes. But beyond the glare of flashing cameras, townsfolk whispered among themselves. The local diner, once a cheerful place filled with chatter, had become the hub of speculation. Patrons sat in tight circles, lowering their voices as they asked one another, who were they afraid of? What was watching them? The sheriff, exhausted but determined, reminded everyone that the investigation was ongoing, yet even he couldn't mask the unease in his voice. His own daughter had been friends with the missing teens, and each clue dug up from the soil felt like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. Meanwhile, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The trees stood taller, their branches casting shadows that looked almost like figures reaching out. At night, a few brave townsfolk reported seeing strange lights deeper in the woods, flickering and moving unnaturally, as though guiding or warning anyone who dared to step further in. Hunters swore they heard voices calling faintly in the distance, voices that sounded like teenagers laughing one moment and crying the next. But when they followed the sound, it always vanished into the wind. For the families, these tales brought no comfort, only torment, for they wondered if their children had tried to call out all those years ago and no one had been there to listen. The discovery of the notes ignited a new wave of fear and curiosity. What had begun as a tragic story of vanished youths had now become a legend tinged with supernatural suspicion. And as the soil continued to give up secrets piece by piece, the town realized that the truth, when finally uncovered, might be far more horrifying than the mystery itself. The final days of excavation in the forest were unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Word had spread quickly about the unsettling discoveries, the bones, the torn belongings, the notes written in fear. Crowds gathered at the forest's edge, held back by yellow tape, as law enforcement worked under the dim light of floodlamps that cast long, eerie shadows. The air smelled of damp earth, gasoline from the machinery, and something older, heavier, that no one dared name aloud. Then, in the silence of a late evening, the diggers hit something more solid than soil. Shovels scraped, and soon they uncovered the outline of a shallow grave. Inside lay skeletal remains arranged in a way that spoke not of nature's randomness but of human hands. The bones were tangled together as if whoever buried them had no time, or no care, to separate them. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, and sobs broke from parents who had prayed for decades to find answers, only to be met with this grim revelation. But the horror didn't stop there. Alongside the bones was a rusted tin box, sealed tight though weathered by years underground. When it was pried open, inside were photographs, grainy, faded images showing the missing teenagers in the days before they vanished. They weren't happy snapshots from school or home. These were pictures taken in the woods, from a distance, as though someone had been watching, stalking, documenting their every move. The implications sent shivers down every spine. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed them, they had hunted them. The notes now made sense, the warnings scrawled in trembling handwriting. We can hear them at night. They are watching us. It wasn't paranoia, it had been real. The sheriff, standing with the weight of his badge and his grief pressing down, ordered the area locked down. For him, it was no longer just about solving an old case but about facing a darkness that had lingered in his town for years. Families cried, reporters swarmed, and the entire forest seemed alive with a silence that felt like it was holding on to the last of its secrets. Some said the shadows between the trees moved that night, figures flickering just beyond the light of the lamps, as if those who had haunted the teenagers still lingered, watching the living unearth their work. By dawn, the town was forever changed. The mystery of the vanished friends was no longer a quiet wound but an exposed nightmare. Answers had come, but they carried with them the weight of terror and sorrow that no one could ever wash away. And as the gravesite was sealed off and the investigation expanded, one thought echoed in every mind: if the stalker had once walked among them, could they still be out there, hidden in plain sight, watching?